Hi, in this video I'm going to talk about propositions 101 to 103 in Proclus's Elements of Theology. And this video is part of a series of videos on the elements of theology. Here's a link to the playlist. Also, throughout the series, I have been using the E.R. Dodds translation, and there's a link to that in the description box. So we have three interesting propositions to look at today. I'll start, of course, with proposition 101. And this one reads, all things which participate intelligence are preceded by the unparticipated intelligence. Those which participate life are preceded by the unparticipated life. And those which participate being are preceded by the unparticipated being. And of these three unparticipated principles, being is prior to life and life to intelligence. Well, as for the order of the terms in each series, I don't imagine this to be confusing to anyone who has been following the elements so far. Each series is headed by an unparticipated monad that is outside of the series, that transcends it, and functioning as the cause of it. And then you've got the participated monad that is immanent in the participants, and then the series. So this is very much consistent with proposition 23, which we have revisited many times already. And here again is a diagram that I'm sure you're all familiar with by now. Here we see the unparticipated cause at the top, the participant at the bottom, and in the middle, the unparticipated gives something of itself to make a participated monad that is immanent in that the participants can directly participate in. Now, what is being added here in proposition 101 is the prominence of being over life and life over intellect. And so looking at this diagram clockwise, we see that we have three unparticipated monads, being and then life and then intellect. In other writings of Proclus's, this is called the intelligible triad. Okay, so now in proposition 101, we're going to take a look at why these three terms must be in this order. Now, Proclus is going to start here, though, by explaining the order of unparticipated, then participated, and then the participants. For in the first place, because in each order of existence, unparticipated terms precede the participated, there must be intelligence prior to things intelligence, life prior to living things, and being prior to things which are. So for intelligence is to participate intelligence, of course, there must be a participated monad. And then we add to this that before that participated monad, there must be the unparticipated monad that is separate, that is transcendent over that. And this follows from what I ended with in my last video. There's a reference there to proposition 100. That was this one right here. Each series is headed by an uncaused first principle, but those unparticipated monads are in turn dependent from the one or the good, which is the first principle without qualification. So scrolling back down, coming back to proposition 101. Okay, let's now move on to seeing the order of being, life, intellect. So secondly, since the cause of more numerous effects precedes the cause of fewer, so this is the principle he's going to be depending on for the rest of this proposition. So let's take a look at proposition 60. And this one reads, whatever principle is the cause of a greater number of effects is superior to that which has a power limited to fewer objects, and which gives rise to parts of those existences constituted by the other as wholes. So this is a line of reasoning that we've already seen a number of times. We're going to see here that being gives rise to more effects than does life, and life gives rise to more effects than does intellect. All right, now let's go back to Proposition 101. So back at Proposition 101, I'm going to read from "and secondly." And secondly, since the cause of more numerous effects precedes the cause of fewer, among these principles being will stand foremost, for it is present to all things which have life and intelligence, since whatever lives and shares in intellection necessarily exists. But the converse is not necessarily true, since not all that exists lives and exercises intelligence. Okay, so being would be at the top of that triad. And then life has the second place, for whatever shares in intelligence shares in life, but not conversely, since many things are alive but remain devoid of knowledge. And the third principle is intelligence. For whatever is in any measure capable of knowledge both lives and exists. If then being gives rise to a greater number of effects, life to fewer, and intelligence to yet fewer, then being stands foremost, next to it life, and then intelligence. And I just want to add, though, that even though intelligence is at the end of the triad, it would be a mistake to think that it is relatively weak in Proclus's system. And Propositions 102 and 103 are going to more fully spell out the relationship of these three terms to one another and how they function. Now let's go on to take a look at how these unparticipated terms function. So here's Proposition 102. All that in any sense exists is composite of limit and infinite because of the primal being. All that lives has self-movement because of the primal life. And all that is cognitive participates knowledge because of the primal intelligence. So we're seeing a little bit of what it means to be a member of each of these series. And Proposition 102 is actually the implication of Proposition 97. I opened my previous video with this proposition. Let's refresh our memories on it. And this one reads, the originative cause of each series communicates its distinctive property to the entire series. And what the cause is primitively, the series is by remission. And we saw that remission means the declension appropriate to secondary existences. So this is referring to the proper diminution of power and essence that progresses as the series unfolds. And I talked about that in my last video. Okay, so the unparticipated term in each series communicates its own distinctive property to the whole series. And now, back at Proposition 102, Proclus is going to build on that. He writes, for if the unparticipated term in each series communicates its own distinctive property to all existences which fall under the same series, and that was Proposition 97, so here's the implication of that. It is plain that the primal being communicates to all things limit together with infinitude, being itself the primal compound of these two. And that point was Proposition 89. Also, life communicates the movement inherent in it, inasmuch as life is the first procession or movement away from the steadfast substance of being. And thirdly, intelligence communicates knowledge, since the summit of all knowledge is in the intelligence, which is the first knower. Now there's a lot being tied up together here. Proclus is connecting this triad with the triad remain, proceed, and revert. So how is this so? It's because he describes life as the first movement away from steadfast being. It's this sentence right here. Life is the first procession or movement away from the steadfast substance of being. So being is the remaining, the abiding, the steadfast term. Life is the procession term. And then he also goes on then to describe intelligence as the summit of knowledge. And this would be so because intellect reverts to its cause and so knows itself. And that's what would make it the summit of knowledge. And so that is why we can add these terms, remain, proceed, revert, to this triad. We were introduced to these terms, remaining, proceeding, and reverting, back in propositions 26 through 39. For anyone who feels they need a refresher on these terms, I do recommend reviewing those propositions. Again, that was propositions 26 through 39. And now we come to proposition 103. We're going to be spending a bit of time here. This is a confusing one, but we're going to take it in steps. Okay, so first, here's the proposition. All things are in all things, but in each according to its proper nature. For in being, there is life and intelligence. In life, being and intelligence. And in intelligence, being and life. So these three are all in all. But each of these exists upon one level intellectually, upon another vitally, and on the third existentially. So he took the triad backwards from intellect up to the hyparxis, being. And right off the bat, we notice here that he is citing proposition 65. So let's take a look at what that one is. And this one reads, all that subsists in any fashion has its being either in its cause as an originative potency or as a substantial predicate or by participation after the manner of an image. So we can talk of three iterations of a term, and I highlighted some of the key phrases in the body there. We see it can be pre-existing in its cause, it can be in the product, the latter participating it, or it can be between these two, in its own station. So back when I originally talked about Proposition 65, I used this diagram. And this diagram is maybe easiest for us if we consider it in terms of life, because life is in its own station in that middle spot. And so there's life. So if we imagine life in the corner there, then we would see that life is pre-existent in its cause. You can think of it as seed form in being. And then in intellect, life is there by participation. Intellect participates in its priors. And this is going to be the basic blueprint for where Proclus is going in Proposition 103. It's going to get more complicated, though, because we have to apply these terms not only to life, but also to being and to intellect. So now we're going to see what Proclus does with this. So he starts off, for since each character may exist either in its cause or as a substantial predicate or by participation, as we just saw, since in the first term of any triad, the other two are embraced as in their cause. I'm going to pause there for a moment and let's think about that one. In the first term of any triad, the other two are embraced as in their cause. So we are taking this triad and making each of the three elements of it a triad in its own right. And so the first triad that we're going to create is the one at the top of the diagram. And in this first term, the other two, this is being, of course, and the other two are embraced as in their cause. So there we see life and intellect but they haven't yet really come to birth. They are still there causally, or pre-existing in their cause. You might think of it as seed form. Okay, so that's the first term. Then he goes on to say that in the mean term, the first is present by participation, and the third is in its cause. Coming back to our diagram, we can now add this. So the mean term is life, and we see that the first, which is being, is present by participation. Life is participating in being. Being is its prior. And the third is in it causally, meaning intellect is still there in a seed form of sorts, because life precedes intellect. And then coming back to our text, we see that the third contains its priors by participation. And so that third is intellect, and it contains being in life by participation. They are both the priors of intellect, so it participates both of them. Okay, so now after setting up those three, he's going to show what follows. In being, there are pre-embraced life and intelligence. Pre-embraced, meaning that they are there causally. But then he goes on to say that because each term is characterized not by what it causes, since this is other than himself, nor by what it participates, since this is extrinsic in origin, but by its substantial predicate, then life and intelligence are present there after the mode of being as existential life and existential intelligence. Actually, I'm going to pause for a moment again. Substantial predicate means that this is the term substantially, or in its own station, to use the language of Proposition 65. So before we go on, let's add this also to our diagram. And so now our diagram looks something like this. Each term is characterized by its substantial predicate. So that first triad is being substantially, but it contains life and intellect causally. The second triad is life substantially. It contains being by participation and intellect causally. The third triad is intellect substantially, and it contains both being and life by participation. So I hope you're all with me so far. And now he's going to make it just a little bit more confusing. He's going to add something more. He goes on to say that life and intelligence are present there in being after the mode of being as existential life and existential intelligence. So now we need to add some different terms to our diagram. So this is what we have built so far, but now we're going to change the labels to the first triad. So we can say that life is causally in being, or we can call this iteration of life existential life. And the same goes for intellect as well. And then going back to the text, we see that in life are present being by participation and intelligence in its cause, but each of these vitally. So again, we can keep these labels for the second triad, but we can also talk of vital being and vital intellect. And he ends by saying that in intelligence, both life and being are there by participation, and each of them intellectually. For the being of intelligence is cognitive, and its life is cognition. And there you have one very long sentence. Okay, so now let's add this last piece to our diagram. Okay, so again, looking at our third triad, we see that being and life are both there by participation. But other labels we can also give these is we can talk of intellectual being and intellectual life. Because as he said at the end there, the being of intelligence is cognitive and its life is cognition. All right, so what is the point of all this? Well, one thing we can take away from it is that when we talk of intelligible being, life, and intellect, we don't mean that they are truly separate and distinct from one another. So logically, we do distinguish these three. And Proposition 35, by the way, was the one that focused on why it's why it's 3 and not 2 or 4 or some other number. And that is an important proposition, so it's one worth reviewing if you don't recall it. But here, the focus is that we logically distinguish these three, but they're not really distinct. All is in all according to its own proper nature. And that brings us to the end of another video. Your likes and comments are always appreciated. And as always, I do hope you will join me next time. Thank you very much.